For Canadians, seeking justice in the face of this human tragedy is to work through the democratic process to persuade the Canadian government to reduce military spending, increase spending on social and environmental protection programs, honor human and environmental interests, to take action on reducing Canada's carbon emissions, and especially to work for a strong international treaty on climate change that would avert catastrophic, unstoppable climate change and promote a safe climate world for our children and grandchildren. Working for social justice and climate justice is at the core of who we are as Christians. It is challenging work, but it's essential if we are to ensure that the earth can sustain humankind and provide enough for all, both now and for generations to come. But we're not alone. We are part of a community of people, accompanied by God, whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. The prophet Micah gives us a vision of the goal we strive for. He said, "They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Every man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken." Usually that quotation ends with converting the swords into plowshares and the spears into pruning hooks, and nation won't take up sword against nation, etc. But they omit the second part, which is equally important. Every man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. Micah is saying that peace is not just the absence of war. It's not just a matter of converting the weapons of war to farming implements. No. Micah also speaks of vines and fig trees, a world of abundance where justice prevails. Everyone has enough, and no one need to worry about where their next meal is coming from or whether they can find affordable housing. Micah is speaking in prophetic witness to a vision of the kingdom of God, where God's economy of enough for all has been reestablished, and there is justice and peace. Jesus, through his passionate, nonviolent challenge to the violent and unjust domination system of his time, began the process of establishing the kingdom or reign of God on earth. And I believe that God is calling us to take action to help bring it to completion. How do we go about doing this? Well, whenever and wherever people enter into compassionate and just relationships with one another, the kingdom of God is being realized. Whenever we take steps to reduce our carbon footprint, the kingdom of God is being realized. Whenever we engage in advocacy with government representatives to dismantle unjust systems and beliefs and replace them with others that promote social and economic justice, we're giving prophetic witness to the kingdom of God. And when we advocate with government representatives and political candidates for immediate strong action on climate change, we are engaging in prophetic witness to the kingdom of God. Sometimes the kingdom wanes or even disappears. For example, when we treat others with disrespect or intolerance, when human rights are violated, when we are silent in the face of the poverty and misery that afflicts so much of our world, when we allow unfettered capitalism and greed to wreak destruction of the biosphere, when we continue to tolerate stockpiles of 16,000 nuclear weapons in the world and the risk that they pose to humankind and the earth. Conversely, our actions towards social justice, economic justice, and climate justice are like seeds that we sow, like the tiny mustard seed that grows and becomes the largest plant in the garden, like the yeast that swells the dough and produces a loaf. Small acts that are cumulatively capable of yielding substantial results. Actions such as signing an online petition or writing a letter to the Prime Minister and the Environment Minister urging that Canada take action to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and work with other nations at the UN talks in Paris later this year to conclude a strong climate treaty that will help avert catastrophic, unstoppable climate change. Year after year, the international community has postponed agreement on a climate treaty. At last year's climate talks in Peru, no progress was made either on setting targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or on compensating the poorest populations in the world for loss and damage suffered due to more violent storms and rising seas. Mariana Parvin, an indigenous woman from Bangladesh, told the final plenary session, "It pains me that when I go back, I will tell my people that wealthy governments just talked about which lands will be lost, which communities displaced, which cultures destroyed, and which lives are less important." This year, 2015, governments have said that they intend to sign a climate treaty. I believe that we must do all we can to ensure that they do not fail. In the end, it's a matter of life or death for future generations and the planet itself. As William Hague, Britain's Secretary of State and former leader of the British Conservative Party, put it, you cannot have food security, water security, or energy security without climate security. And with that, I will end.
Thank you. Are you open for
Questions? Sure.
Sure. I have a microphone here if anybody needs the microphone. Anybody has any questions?
And I'm just curious about your background and when you really sort of got on fire and started working so hard. Were you quite a young person? I mean, was this an awareness of yours before climate change actually?
Oh, yes. Well, I started my activism in the early 1980s. You remember President Reagan was in office at the time, and he was telling us that we could fight and win a nuclear war without damage to the homelands. I mean, really, seriously. There was a book written by a journalist, Robert Scheer, called With Enough Shovels, and he spent a whole night, apparently, interviewing the Assistant Secretary of Defense in the United States, who told him that if everyone had a shovel and could dig a hole and have a door on top of it and 3 feet of dirt on top of that, that we could survive a nuclear war. He was Assistant Defense Secretary, can you believe it? So a lot of people got active in those days. Those were the days of the Greenham Common, where the women were protesting the cruise missiles in England, and we in Canada were protesting the testing of the cruise missile over the Canadian North. So I got involved that way, and then of course one thing led to the other, and I realized that you can't have peace without social justice as well. And so I was lucky to attend a number of church-sponsored conferences right on these particular subjects. There was a lot of activity around Jubilee. From 1998 to 2000, there was an effort to try and get people to lobby for the cancellation of the debts of the poor countries of the world, because these poor people were struggling under debt and couldn't possibly pay it back, and people were just suffering. Also, I was part of a group that attended a session that was sponsored by the Ecumenical Coalition on Economic Justice. I think it's been rolled into to Kairos now. It's a part of that coalition. But it was on building a moral economy. And I learned so much from that. About neoliberalism, for example, what it is, what the doctrines are, how debt is considered sin, for which a country has to be punished by structural adjustment measures that cut social programs and environmental protection, etc., etc. And I also wanted to challenge. I felt that the mandate for social justice and for this kind of work was so evident in the in scriptures, and I was so excited to find this book by Mark Sporg and John Crossan the last week. It's on Mark's gospel account of the last week in Jesus' life, because he brings out all this good stuff about Jesus' challenge to the Roman domination system of the time and the collaboration of Jewish authorities in it. So that's basically how I came to where I am now. But I feel I have felt a call to engage in this work for quite some time now.
And I have an uncle who is was a top executive in an oil industry corporation, and he had an epiphany, and he had to leave that position, and he has dedicated his life till now to he focuses on the peak oil situation and the recognition that in North American society, we're the ones that are going to struggle the most because we won't have the capacity to survive without all of the benefits of hydro and oil and so on. If indeed it runs out and we are not prepared. Mm-hmm. And so he established, I'm getting to the question, in Peterborough, he was big in establishing the transition town. And I just wondered if you've heard of that, and if people you are associated with here have ever thought of pursuing that kind of direction, so that people in the community could become involved in a way that.
Well, there's an organization here called the CASA, Community Citizens for, what is it called? CASS, for a strong, sustainable salmon arm, and that's been one of their part of their work is to promote this transition, Townsend transition program.
Good.
But not many people know about it, and it's not being actively promoted now.
Well, it's a little bigger in some parts of the country, and of course in Europe there are many transition towns. In Peterborough, it's well established. They've come out with their own coin system for the downtown businesses, their own currency, and they've changed all kinds of local bylaws, so many people can have hen houses, chickens in their backyards, and all ways to sustain themselves without having to rely on the grocery store. So it's just a fascinating, I just wondered if you knew about it.
But if the government used this low dropping oil price as an opportunity to get into renewable energy,
Yes.
and even the oil companies, if they switch to getting renewable energy, we could create many more jobs that are being lost in the oil patch. I've got a letter coming to, going to the Premier of Alberta, reminding him I lived there for 33 years, and I really think that with all the wind in southern Alberta, they ought to be capitalizing more on that.
And they're not talking about the politicians.
Oh, well, there's that too.
I have two things that are sort of related that I want to say. One is, how do we get your message? All the people here probably already feel strongly the way you do, and I always think that the reason things don't get changed is because of education. If people knew what you knew, of course they would do something different. They would have to. And so how do you get this message out to the people that aren't interested in coming here? That's my one part. The other part is, there was a politician not that long ago, that out loud said, I don't know that climate change really exists, or that there's a climate problem. Like, if you've got people in power that refuse to see that, you know, that there is even an issue, how can you get them to change how things are being done?
Well,
They're sort of related.
to answer the first part of your question, well, Kairos has been holding programs for a number of years, and people who are not necessarily involved in churches come to those programs.
Right, and I'm not saying church people, I'm saying people that are interested in, you know, the environment and what you do.
Yeah.
How do we get it out to other people that?
Well, by word of mouth, by talking with your neighbors and friends and your relatives and associates. It really is real missionary work, you know. You've got to engage in talking with people. But on the, especially on climate change, I'm about to put a promo for our program on Earth Day, April 22nd. We're holding a program here in the hall at 7 p.m. on our planet and climate change. What can we do? Is the second part of the title. And we're going to start with 4 short but very powerful films explaining why we have to turn around, why we have to address climate change, and what we have to do.
Politicians to come to that.
Oh, we will.
Like, that would be the thing if we could force the people
Well,
that have the power.
Yeah, we'll certainly invite them.
Yeah.
And Kairos, our committee, has been talking to the various candidates, political candidates. As far as, sometimes though, it's been said that it's kind of useless to try and persuade a climate change denier, that it's probably a waste of time. But you can always find if climate change deniers, well, I think a lot of them have links to the oil and gas industry, for one thing. But there's a long version of an excellent film called Arctic Death Spiral and the Methane Time Bomb, which starts off with, shows some of these climate change deniers in the States, the southern states especially, saying that no, it doesn't exist, it's just part of the natural variations in temperature. It's not true. And then there are there's also a film called Thin Ice, which if you want to find out about the science that investigates climate change and compares how much, you know, our climate is warming, and that it analyzes ice, which contains, you know, oxygen or whatever, that shows what the Earth was like thousands and thousands of years ago compared to now.
Do you think that the politicians that were naysayers before are coming around now? Do you think that they're starting? Because I always heard that for all evidence one way, you can find people that are so-called experts that say the opposite. Do you think people that the politicians are starting to believe and?
I don't know. Do you think so? What do other people think? Do you hear any signs of change of thinking?
I think maybe the winter they had in eastern Canada and the United States this year might make some people think it's a few second class.
Mm-hmm.
As it was.
Yeah.
It still is.
Right.
There's something wrong.
Mhm.
There's something wrong. There has to be.
The oil companies have very deep pockets. And one author said not too long ago, there's no one harder to convince than somebody who is paid to believe something.
Yes.
And
It may
in
be,
a way it's much deeper phenomenon, and that education has got so bad in the States that there is a huge proportion of the population that doesn't trust scientists and doesn't trust science. It's too hard for me to understand, so it can't be true.
Bad science. Yeah.
I'm not saying Canadians are listening any better. We don't have figures.
Yes.
I was going to say 2 things. One is that, there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of small things to help change the climate. And I think we have to have confidence in those people and encourage them. I was at a conference in Kamloops it was Master Gardener Conference, but the city of Kamloops was there, and they had a speaker who was explaining to us how we could be food sustainable in the area of Kamloops. So what they've done, because they said, suppose there was a disaster and there was no way, the highways would be closed on the other side of Kamloops and of course over here, and there would be no access. And you know there's like 1,000 trucks going through this city every day. So if that was not happening and we were landlocked, how would we survive? Where's the food going to come from? So the city of Kamloops has mapped all the farms, those that are sitting in agricultural reserves not being used, or those that are being used. Then they've gone to cultural farms, that is economically producing farms, that are like truck gardens, organic farms. And then thirdly, they went to backyards. And because there's a lot of stuff happening, like chickens and so forth in backyards. And they were amazed at how much food is being produced and how conscious people are of where the food is and what could happen if stuff wasn't coming from California. So I think we have to, and I know there's a movement starting now in this town, but I was trying to map the same kind of thing. So, I mean, we can read Naomi Klein and wish we had Elizabeth May in our riding and all this kind of stuff. But the other thing I was going to say is that it's really important, like we did this in Vancouver when the last time there was a federal election. Our United Church sent people to the all candidates meeting and they had questions to ask. So when it came time for open questions, they stood up and they had a question about climate change, they had a question about homelessness. So they had to think and give us an answer that was representative of their party. So I think there's pressure we can put on, like go to these meetings and hear what the various parties have to say. So there's lots of stuff happening in the local level. Be aware of it, support it, broaden it if you can, but also get to those candidates meetings and ask a few questions.
Exactly, yeah. And I've just been in touch with Kairos's John Dillon, who's the ecological program director, and he says one of the most important things we can do is to find out what views and policies of our candidates are and vote for someone who's going to support strong action on climate change. It's really a civic duty. We have a civic duty to, as responsible.
I wish it was compulsory.
Pardon?
I wish it was compulsory,
Yeah.
like it is in some countries.
Yes. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about activism compared to the 80s, 70s. It's so different now. I mean, I think people get awareness. You know, they sign a petition online. Lots more come, and you can read more and see if it, makes you interested in becoming more active. But what do you think about that?
Oh, well, when I think of the work when I was in Lethbridge and working to promote awareness about programs, to publicize them, and I'd go around with my little notices to every church, and it was such a lot of work. And now I just send everything out by email. It's so much easier, and it's so much easier to stay in touch with people and to get information. That's what I can just go Google for, what I'm looking for, and up it pops.
So the passion is still there.
Yeah.
Maybe even more so because there's so many more.
I think so. And I think,
Contacted and connected.
and young people are becoming more engaged too. And I think that's really, really important. But on what we can do to promote awareness in other people who are not church people, well, writing letters to the editor is really, really important. I think that can make quite a difference.
In late 90s, there was a group of clergy, and we were all in Saskatoon at the time, and that was around the time where we had to have police records checks. And we were all in a gathering one evening and comparing the fact that we'd all passed. Like, we all got through with our police record check intact. And then we started talking about the fact that we probably shouldn't there should be public disobedience amongst all the clergy. If we're really following Jesus's way, there should be public disobedience. We should be protesting and arrested for it. I mean, not that that would show up as a major concern on your police records check, but it really opened up a lot of interesting conversation amongst the clergy. And always we reach the point where we're all accountable to a congregation who has a mission that doesn't fit what we're necessarily believing, right? So our ability to go beyond what we really believe is often constrained to a point by the congregation's mission.
When you say to what we believe, do you mean what we believe about the Christian message, or
What we believe about what action ought to be happening from the Christian message? What ways we should be treating each other, the ways in which we should be concerned about the environment, or any of the other issues as you so well spoke about in your talk. It's not always easy. So that's when I was thinking, even with politicians, we really need to do the grounds, like from the ground up. People need to start to say, this is the way the world needs to be, and build it around them in their own communities. And then start letting the politicians know that here's who we are, and if you want to represent us, you need to represent what we believe. Yeah.
But I think that the church has kind of missed a lot of the social message of the gospel. I got this little bit from the website of Marcus Borg, who, by the way, died just in January. Jesus was not a secular social revolutionary, he was God's revolutionary. And God's passion, what God is passionate about, according to Jesus, is for an earth in which swords are beaten into plowshares, in which every family shall live under their own vine and fig tree, not just subsistence, but more than subsistence. This was the passion of Jesus, and for Christians, Jesus is the revelation of God's passion.